Hi again then guys, and welcome to another installment of the Beards and Cars podcast, which you can grab in its audio-only form down below via SoundCloud. And for this particular topic, I wanted it to be a little bit more of an abstract discussion, once again, but still to do with gaming, still to do with cars. And as you saw from the title and the thumb, it's a very personal one, yet again. We talked about a lot of personal countdowns and topics and discussions, like your favourite cars in games, your favourite games in general, maybe your favourite non-racing games, stuff like that. This one, though, is almost more personal even than that, because we all have our favourites, we all have games that we like, games that we dislike, but what about the games that actually moulded us, the games that crafted our love, not just for gaming, but maybe even beyond games, into the real world, our love for actual cars, vehicles, racing, whatever the case may be. And so, that is the topic that I wanted to discuss. Now, for me, I've narrowed it down to 5. You don't necessarily have to stick to 5 yourself, but I would recommend trying to keep it minimal. Maybe 5, maybe more, but I think the fewer you do, the more important they will tend to be. Because for me, this is not my favourite games. That's very important to say. And for some of these games, I might not actually include footage of them because I haven't played all of them on the channel. But I wanted to choose the games that for me were landmark moments in my life in terms of crafting my love for a whole genre of driving or racing games, or for a whole type of vehicle that I still love to this day, that kind of thing, or just something that was monumental in my racing game career, if you will. So, as a quick example, Driver San Francisco is not in my top 5. Even though it would be in my top 5 favourite racing games of all time, because this, as I said, is not that list. Because as much as I love it, that game arrived a little bit later in my life, and it didn't really reinforce or add anything new to what I already loved. It was just a really good example of stuff that I already loved. So that one, for instance, is not on the list. However, I am going to do this list chronologically, so the order in which these appeared in my life. And kicking us off, first of all, is probably not too surprisingly Gran Turismo 2. Now, Gran Turismo 2 was not the first racing game I ever played. Technically, I think that was Mario on the Nintendo 64, but I remember nothing about that, and I've, as many of you know, never really been a huge fan of racing games that don't feature real cars anyway, so I can have fun with it, but it just doesn't have the same appeal to me. Even as like a 6-year-old kid, it didn't. Gran Turismo 2, though, I remember playing that. I remember loving it. I remember my dad was, of course, way better at the time. I used to watch him play it a lot and point out certain cars that I wanted to unlock and wanted to win and wanted to buy. And many of those cars still have a special place with me. Of course, I did a collab video in this same series with Ness in Pajamas, who features regularly on the channel as part of the team, and we talked about some of our favourite cars from GT2, and many of those are because they're so crucial to my childhood. Of course, the standout is always the Spas F1, but there are plenty of others too. And for me, Gran Turismo 2 is possibly even the most important one on this list because it arrived so early in my life. It was a time when the PS1 was the best option around. Gran Turismo 2 didn't have any rivals. It was so good. There was no Forza. Test Drive wasn't what it is now. And it was just kind of unmatched, especially in terms of size. You had a couple of rivals in a general sense, like Colin McRae, or, you know, Tocker, that kind of stuff, but they weren't exactly on the same playing field. They weren't even in the same stadium. But as far as Gran Turismo 2 goes, yeah, for sure. I still have a lot of love for the game. I would still classify it as being my probably second favourite Gran Turismo game ever, after Gran Turismo 4. And yeah, I mean, of course it's got to be on the list. The next one, I believe, is probably the most surprising to many of you, even if you've been around on the channel for quite some time, because this is not a game that I talk about all that often. I've talked about it occasionally, but I've never played it. I might play it on the channel at some point, but as I said, it's not really a game that comes up. And that is Need for Speed Underground, the first one. Now, there's a charm to that game, which I think kind of none of the others have ever had again, at least for me. And again, it is crucial the age that I played it. I was a little bit older than Gran Turismo 2, of course, but still, I was relatively young, probably about, I guess, 10, 12 maybe, something like that. But it was a game that not only crafted a lot of love for things like future Need for Speed games, things like Midnight Club, Juiced even, stuff like that I would end up dabbling in rather than just the professional side of racing like Gran Turismo and Forza offers, but also it crafted a lot of love that I had for vehicles that were tuned for many years, and I think that now I've kind of moved beyond that because of how much I enjoyed it as a kid. I've almost like got all of that out of my system. When I was a kid, I used to want to buy cars and put body kits on them and all that kind of stuff, but I basically just moved beyond that. And some people do still love that in their adult years, of course, max power, all that kind of thing. But for me, I moved past it. But I still really appreciate what that first Need for Speed game did for me. And it also offered a completely different AI experience to what Gran Turismo does. Because most of the time, Gran Turismo, let's be honest, isn't too hard to beat. Whereas arcade games like Midnight Club, Need for Speed, even Test Drive Unlimited, stuff like that, they have such a strong rubber banding system that you'll often have to really push yourself to beat the AI, sometimes more so than Gran Turismo or Forza. So for me, yeah, Need for Speed Underground is definitely a crucial game in my upbringing. The third one is a game that I've already mentioned in this same video, and this is probably my favourite one of the 5, if I had to list them, and that is, of course, Gran Turismo 4. Also on the PS2, this game blew my mind. I had so much fun in Gran Turismo 4. It was also the peak of the time where both me and my dad were playing the game together at the same time. We had our own memory cards, our own career modes. We played it very differently, and there was so much to do. The career mode is colossal. The endurance races are intimidating. The car selection was unheard of among any other game at the time. Enthusia wasn't as big, Test Drive wasn't as big, Forza was nowhere near as big at the time, and it was just, again, like Gran Turismo 2, just an unrivaled experience. Gran Turismo 3 didn't even come close to me. I know a ton of people love that game, but it just never appealed to me as much as others do. My dad enjoyed it at the time, but I never got into Gran Turismo 3. I enjoyed certain things from it, like Complex String and the Mazda 787B, but I just didn't really like the game that much. It felt almost like the most arcade of all Gran Turismo games, and as much as I enjoy that in Need for Speed, that's not what I play Gran Turismo for. Whereas in Gran Turismo 4, it was so much more realistic. They tried to take it seriously. The graphics were phenomenal for the time. You could see what all of the cars were supposed to be, which sounds ridiculous to say that now, but trust me, back in the day, there were still games at that point that looked awful in comparison, to the point where you can still look back at Gran Turismo 4 now and say, wow, that car actually looks really good. Of course, it can't rival GT Sport, but it looks great for its age. A little 8MB memory card on a PS2. What an awesome game. And as I said, probably my favourite of these particular 5. The next one for me is another slightly less expected choice, kind of like Need for Speed Underground, but also this is a game that I've talked about a lot more, and I do feature this one on the channel quite a lot. And incidentally, this is a game which I enjoyed at the time, in particular, so much that it actually replaced Gran Turismo 4 as my favourite racing game as I was growing up. And that is, of course, Test Drive Unlimited. Test Drive Unlimited is such a polarising game in a way that very few other racing games that I've seen have been, because there seems to be equally as many people who absolutely love it as people who think it's awful. I find it very strange because I get why people could feel that way. A lot of the races do seem repetitive, the physics are far from realistic, but there's this intangible feeling about that first Test Drive Unlimited game. And I first played it on the PS2 and then moved to the other ones later on, like the PSP. I bought it on the PC but never actually played it, of course on the Xbox 360. And although the PC version is the best all round because of all the mods you can do to it, like the Platinum mod, the Xbox One was the ultimate for me because the graphics were even better. You had bikes as well, which were not on the PS2. I don't think they were on the PSP either. And I mean, what a game. What an incredible game. I still love Test Drive Unlimited. I still like it a lot more than the second game, in fact. And I think that some people who prefer the second game probably played it before the first one, and that's the only reason I think why you'd probably enjoy it more, because in many ways the first game is still better. The graphics are crisper, the textures and the reflections in Test Drive Unlimited look remarkably good. I mean, I was, 12, 13, probably something like that, when I first played Test Drive Unlimited, and I remembered noticing the graphics. And that was something which I never really took much notice of. Even in games that had bad graphics, the most important thing to me was always what cars are in the game and what tracks are in the game after that. But in Test Drive, when I first played it, and I believe, if I recall correctly, I actually watched other people play it, like on YouTube, before I did. And the thing that really stood out to me, as weird and as nerdy as this sounds, was the road. The tarmac in that game looks phenomenal. The graphics still look incredible on the road. I'm not saying it's the most realistic thing around, but there's something about the textures in that game. The way the light bounces off the road, it almost makes the roads in TDU look as if they were the most advanced ever seen in a racing game. Because usually, I mean, let's be honest, you don't even notice the roads in most games. You notice the track, like the corners and that kind of stuff, but you never take any notice of the tarmac. The Gran Turismo 4 at the time just had grey tarmac. Everything had just had grey tarmac, because that's just a racetrack. But because TDU was on the street, the roads looked so good. And also, I think this was a very, very clever thing that they did. If you think of most street racing games at the time, most of them were predominantly at night. And at night, the lights look cool, but you can barely see the road. And that's a clever way of doing it, because it's actually very similar to using CGI in a movie. If you can use CGI in a dark environment, it makes it a lot easier to pass off as realistic. If you make a street racing game at night, the graphics is so much easier than in the broad daylight. So Test Drive Unlimited at the time was one of the few games that took place, you could even argue, predominantly in the daytime. In fact, I'm trying to think back, I don't even know if that first game had nighttime. Did it? I might be wrong. I don't recall ever driving at night in Test Drive Unlimited, and I'm sure that must be wrong, but it feels like that's correct. Obviously there was in the second game, but I don't remember ever driving at night in that first game. Now, the roads, as I said, look phenomenal. It had such a huge, important part for me, and of all the cars, or not of all the cars, of all the games, I should say, on this list, I actually believe that Test Drive Unlimited might be the most important one. Because Gran Turismo 2, of course, was where it began, so by definition, it's always going to have a huge place of importance. But Test Drive Unlimited, I strongly believe, was the game that informed me what kind of player I am. What kind of car enthusiast I am, what kind of, to some degree, person I am. Because, as weird as that may sound, I realised after playing Test Drive Unlimited, even as a kid, that I am not a racer. The thing I always enjoyed most about racing games was not the racing, it was driving. It was experiencing the cars, having fun with them, collecting them, just appreciating these beautiful machines. And I didn't need to win races with them to enjoy them. And I know that for many people that's not where they get most of their enjoyment in racing games. Even for my dad, for instance, at the time, my dad never got into Test Drive Unlimited. He was purely Gran Turismo because it was all about winning the races for him. He had a 100% win ratio through the entire career mode of Gran Turismo 4, including the endurance races. It never dropped below 100%. I never even tried. I never even aimed to do that. Mine was more like, I think, probably 94%, something like that. But in Test Drive Unlimited, it really did show me, I think, what kind of car enthusiast I am. For me, it's all about enjoying the cars, not just racing them. And I think to some degree, you could even argue that Test Drive Unlimited formed the basis of the cars that I've even bought in real life. Because if you think of the two cars that I've bought, the Touareg V10 and now the Maserati, they are not the fastest thing around. They are fast, but you could certainly find faster things for the money. That's not the point for me. It's cars that have the whole package. They're not just the fastest thing in a straight line or around a track. They've got the looks, the sound, the luxury, that kind of oddball, almost niche or exclusive factor. It's a very Test Drive Unlimited way of thinking, and I truly believe that Test Drive Unlimited has had a huge part in not necessarily crafting my love of cars, but allowing me to have self-realization about why I love cars and the kind of cars that I love. And I will always thank Test Drive Unlimited for that, because I think that was a very important thing. In a similar way to with my writing, last year I suddenly realized what kind of writer I am. I write novellas. The stories that I want to tell don't need 500, 600, 700 pages. So that was a crucial moment in my life, because it single-handedly allowed me to write, finish, and publish 2 books. Something which I'd never done before because I'd never realised what kind of writer I was. Likewise with Test Drive Unlimited, it, I believe, unlocked my realisation of why I love cars and the vehicles that I love. And last, but definitely not least on my list, you might think it's a strange choice to end on, but for me this was another massive moment in my life, because it was the moment after Gran Turismo 4 in particular, but because I was playing Test Drive Unlimited and GT4, like back and forth all the time, I would classify it primarily as being after Gran Turismo 4. And that is, Gran Turismo 5 was years away, and I still wanted to play something new. So I decided to go to the dark side. And I bought an Xbox 360. And of course, I purchased Forza Motorsport 2. I'd never played the first game, which, funnily enough, was exactly the same with Gran Turismo. I'd never played the first one up until that point. And Forza 2 just opened my eyes to this whole new world of racing. Not just with the racing side, but once again, like TDU, with the cars. And there were so many cars, even back then, that Gran Turismo had never had. You've got to remember that up until this point, Gran Turismo had still never had a single Ferrari, Lamborghini, or Maserati. Not in the versions of the game that I played, at least. And then here comes Forza 2 out of nowhere for me, and has tons of Ferraris, Porsches, Lamborghinis, Maseratis, Paganis, even Koenigsegg. Oh yeah, it blew my mind. For sure it did. And I thoroughly loved it. And from then on, I actually did not buy another Gran Turismo game until GT6. I played Forza 2, Forza 3, Forza 4, and then I believe after that, I bought Gran Turismo 6, then went back to Gran Turismo 5, and then went on until now. And at this point, I own and have played all of each of the franchise's games. And of course, there are a couple that I haven't. There are certain prologues that I haven't gotten into. I've never played Forza Apex. But, you know, the mainstream games is what I'm talking about. And so, that's my 5. The 5 games that I truly believe have been the most influential in my growing up. And of course, the earlier that you can think back, chances are the more influential the games will be. Because once you become an adult, and once you have been playing games for many years, I would argue, and I'd love to hear you guys' thoughts on this as well, I would argue it's actually kind of harder to find a new game once you've already grown up that has that same effect. Because a lot of it is nostalgia. And of course, nostalgia is not a bad thing. Humans spend, I can't remember what the exact number is, but a crazy high percentage of the time we spend thinking about memories, even just in daily life. So nostalgia is not a bad thing. Humans live for nostalgia. I love these 5 games, and although some of them might not be in, for instance, my top 10, Need for Speed probably wouldn't be, but I think in terms of my growth as a player, as a car enthusiast, and as a person to some degree, these are the 5 for me. So, as I said, tell me what yours are down below, and if you could maybe put some reasoning as to why each one is there, then of course we can have some more in-depth discussions, not just with me, but also with each other in the comments. And that's, I think, what the great thing about these particular episodes is. You can get a little bit deeper into a subject, and maybe even realise some things about yourself that you hadn't thought of before. Because sometimes it might seem meaningless, it's just a racing game, but not necessarily. It could be more important than that in your life. But overall, that's it for this installment. Of course, I will see you guys next week. And for now, as always, thanks for watching.